We're ready now to call our Transportation and Commerce meeting to order. Please call the roll.
Alderman Boyd,
Present.
Alderman Moore, Alderman Vaccaro, Alderman Cone,
Present.
Alderman Muhammad,
Here.
Alderman Oldenburg, Alderwoman Middlebrook,
Present.
Chair Lady Davis.
Present.
5 present, you have quorum.
Thank you. Alderman Oldenburg asked to be excused today, and Alderman Moore.
So noted.
Thank you. Approval of our minutes from our, we have none. This is our first meeting of this session, so we shall move on. The first item on our agenda is Board Bill number 3.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Good morning.
My name is Robert Solerano. I'm the Properties Division Manager for the airport. We're requesting your approval for a lease agreement with the Federal Aviation Administration. It's a lease of approximately 28,096 square feet of undeveloped land on airport property for the installation of an LWAS component. It's a low-level wind shear alert system component that will be designed and built on the site. There is no revenue for this site. It is to the FAA for an airport-related item. The term of the lease agreement begins March 1st, 2019, and ends September 30th, 2039. Approval required is the Director of Airports, Airport Commission, the Board of V&A, and the Board of Aldermen. We respectfully request your approval of this lease agreement with the Federal Aviation Administration.
I thank you for that briefing on Board Bill number 3. You also have before you, committee members, a short executive summary that gives you all the items of major concern outlined for you. I'd like to start and see if any members have questions. Alderman Boyd.
Sure, thank you. Good morning. It's my second round in 16 years being on transportation. Did I hear you say there was no financial reward for the city in this lease agreement?
That's correct, sir. It's with the FAA for an airport, a component related to airport safety and for their operation at the airport. So there is no revenue to the city for this.
The regulatory agency.
Okay, so just explain to me, just for educational purposes, why we have to do something like that.
Well, we fall under Part 139, which is the FAA regulation for airports, so the FAA ultimately is responsible.
Ron, I'm sorry, can you come closer to the mic?
I'm sorry.
Thank you.
We fall under 139 for airport regulations under the FAA, and they ultimately have responsibility to ensure that your airport is operating in a safe manner. One of the pieces of instrument that they're installing at their cost, the airport does not pay for the installation of this nor the cost of the equipment. That is all done by the FAA, but they have the right, as the FAA, to be able to lease land from us to put this equipment on to ensure the safety of the airport.
So is it, when it's a public safety issue, we give them free land? Or if they decide to build a garage for whatever reason, I'm just making something up, do we give them free lease agreements for that too?
No, the FAA doesn't have the right to build a garage. This is related to the operational safety of the airport. Mm-hmm. So this piece of land that it will be going on is just a lease to do that. It's to buy and install this piece of equipment so that we have the utmost safest airport.
Okay, give me another example of why we would do this type of lease agreement with the FAA. So that's public safety, so, right? Give me another example.
I mean, yes, I mean, if they're going to ask to put a piece of equipment to ensure the safety of our airport and we say no to that, then we jeopardize our grant assurances for the future of any FAA dollars.
Right, and not that I'm against this. Again, this is just for educational purposes. So, for example, if they wanted to move the tower.
The what, I'm sorry?
The tower. What's the name of the tower?
The tower.
So if they want to move that, then we would do a lease agreement and that would be zero cost if they decide to do that.
I mean, they built a new one probably, 12 years ago?
12, 13 years ago.
And typically those have a 40 or 50-year lifespan, but
we would do the same type of agreement, that's what I'm asking.
if it were an air traffic.
Or they have a separate MOA as well for the airport with about 80 little sites on it. throughout the airport. You know, when you look out on the airfield, the red and white boxes you see and things like that, that's all related to FAA site.
And that's all free?
Yes.
Okay. Thank you.
You're welcome.
All right. Alderman Cone.
I don't have any questions at this time, thank you.
Thank you. Alderman Muhammad.
No questions, Madam Chairwoman.
Thank you very much. Alderwoman Middlebrook.
No questions.
All right. I have no questions on this topic. I'll entertain a motion to.
I make a motion that we pass out Board Bill number 3 with a due pass recommendation.
It's been moved in second. Please call the roll.
Alderman Boyd,
Aye.
Alderman Moore, Alderman Vaquero, Alderman Cone,
Aye.
Alderman Muhammad, Alderman Oldenburg, Alderwoman Middlebrook,
Aye.
Chair Lady Davis.
Aye.
That's 5 aye votes.
Thank you. Board Bill number 3 has been approved. The next item on our agenda is Board Bill number 13.
Okay. Good morning, Madam Chairman, members of the committee. I'm Jim Garavaglia, and I'm with Comptroller's Office, Deputy Comptroller for Finance and Development, and we have, again, before you, Board Bill number 13, which authorizes and directs the city on behalf of the airport to issue both refunding and revenue bonds. With me today from our municipal advisory team, we have Ramon Ortega and David Stinfill from Siebert. We have Rebecca Perry-Glickstein from PFM. We also have with us today our senior manager, book-running senior manager, Eric Cowan from Bank of America. And we also have 2 representatives from Bond Council team, Angela Odlum and Tom Ray. At this time, I would like to ask David Stinfill to come up, if recognized, Madam Chairman, and present walk you through the presentation that you all should have.
All right, thank you.
Thanks, Jim. Morning, Madam Chairwoman and members of the committee. My name is David Stinfill, again, from Siebert Cisneros Schenck, the lead financial advisor for the airport on this refunding, financing, and new money transaction. If you have this presentation in front of you, you can please turn to page 1. I'll just walk you through briefly. If you have any questions along the way, of course, just stop me, let me know. As the city is aware, over the years, it's been very prudent in actively managing its airport revenue bonds and including several different refunding transactions for savings. Most recently, in 2017, the airport saved over $25 million in net present value debt service by executing a refunding of some 2007 A bonds and B bonds. And we basically are trying to do a similar transaction now in 2019 by refunding the outstanding 2009 A1 bonds. They're currently outstanding the total amount of about $93 million, and they have a July 1st, 2019, call date. In conjunction with the refunding.
Can you explain what call date means?
Absolutely, that's a great question. So typically when municipal bonds are issued, they typically have a covenant in the contract that basically says that the city at its will can decide to defease or redeem the bonds within a certain amount of time. And typically, the call period starts at 10 years from the date of issuance. So the 2009 A1 bonds were issued back in 2009. 10 years from that point, which is July 1, 2019, there's a covenant that the city can take advantage of in order to basically refinance the debt on the July 1 call date. Thank you for that question. So in addition to the 2009 A1 refunding, the airport also expects to issue bonds to fund approximately $24 million of projects. And these projects were approved as part of the 5-year 2017 to 2021 CIP a long time ago. So this was part of the sort of plan all along. And I should also note at this current moment, the market is very advantageous for the city to basically do this refinancing and new money issuance. Rates are at or near their all-time lows, and in addition to that, there's a tremendous amount of investor demand for municipal bonds, particularly for specialty credits similar to airports or airport revenue bonds. If we turn to page 2, we walk into the plan of finance in a bit more depth. Starting at the top, you can see the the top graph shows how the airport's debt is currently laid out, which is very conservative. It's has a declining debt service pattern over the next several years, which is a great sort of pattern that investors and rating agencies love to see. Kudos to the city and the airport for sort of having this debt service layout. The refunding transaction is currently planned to structure savings upfront. So in the first several years, you'll see those sort of green bars that represent where we're expecting to lock in savings, which is about $5 to $6 million per year. The rationale for locking in savings up front is that it allows the airport to keep its total airport revenue debt service below the $60 million mark, which allows it to control CPE, or cost per employment, in a manner that's consistent with where it's been over the past couple of years. The new money transaction is expected to amortize over the next potentially 30 years, and that's the current plan, but that is subject to change. And the rationale for that, again, is that long-term rates are very low and allows the airport to spread out debt service over a number of years. If I can draw your attention to the table on the bottom, it points out some of the expected results of this transaction. The first is that on an all-in true interest cost basis, we expect the transaction to come in at a very low rate, which is just north of 3% at 3.03%. And you can see that on the far right column where it says total. And in terms of total PV savings, it's a very substantial amount that we're expecting, north of $25 million, currently estimated to be around $27.6 million of MPV savings. And that produces, on a percentage basis, as a percentage of refunded par, about 30% of refunded par. And I should note that the municipal market standard is to usually do or execute a current refunding when you have at least 3% savings. So at this point, you're 10 times the amount of the sort of municipal market standard for the amount of percent savings that you want to lock in. I turn to page 3. Given that the city is contemplating and evaluating a privatization or a lease, long-term lease of the airport, we wanted to make sure that the city and the airport is protected in the case that it does decide to move forward with a P3 or privatization lease sort of transaction. And to that end, the plan is to currently include a extraordinary redemption provision, and that provision would be unique to this transaction, and it would allow for the city and the airport to defease the bonds at the cost of the 100% of amortized value of the bonds within the first 4 years of the transaction. So if a privatization were to occur within 4 years of the closing date of the bonds, the city and the airport would be able to defease the bonds at almost the same cost as it would have been had the bonds been left outstanding and there was no refunding on the 2009 A1 bonds. I'll turn to page 4 now, where we just talk a bit about some of the upcoming key dates for the transaction. Currently, we're contemplating posting the primary offering document, which is a preliminary official statement that investors will peruse on Thursday, June 6th. About a week after that, on Thursday, June 13th, we're planning to go to market and actually price the bonds, and that's the date that we'll lock in the interest rates. On Wednesday, June 26th, we're expected to close the bonds in advance of the July 1st call date for the 2009 A1 bonds. And then lastly, on page 5, we wanted to list the financing team members, or firms rather, that have been actively participating on this transaction on behalf of the city and the airport. Most of these firms, if not all of them, I believe, have been engaged on airport revenue bond financings for the city over a number of years as well. So I guess I can pause now if there's any questions.
Okay. Did you want to make any other presentations before we go to questions? Did anybody else need to speak? This is very thorough. Okay, thank you. So let's start with questions, please. Alderman Boyd.
Sure, thank you for your presentation. Out of curiosity, currently on these bonds, how much money is in restricted reserves?
In restricted, I don't believe that there's any money in restricted reserves. There's a debt service reserve fund that's associated on a series-by-series basis with different series of bonds. And for this, for the 2009 A1 bonds, I believe the reserve fund is approximately roughly around the $10 million mark.
10 million. And the 10 million correlates to the 93 million?
Yes, so when the 2009 A1 bonds were initially issued, as part of the transaction, the city set aside approximately just north of $10 million in the instance that for some reason the city or the airport wasn't able to pay debt service, it could access that $10 million as a reserve to make bondholders whole. The way that we're considering incorporating that into the transaction for this refunding is that a portion of the $10 million may be released. Therefore, release being that the city could use that money to pay down some of its debt service. And there'd be basically a reduction in that reserve amount because the aggregate amount of new debt service is going to be lower than the amount of debt service on the old bonds. So it allows the city to release some of that money to use as a source of funds.
Out of curiosity, you have any idea what that might be?
The size of the release?
Finance it and reduce the amount of debt.
So it's a direct correlation, the amount that you could release. So if the city decides to release the full amount, then it would reduce debt service by, or reduce the par amount of issuance by just north of approximately 10 million. But that's an estimate at this time because that's sort of still under works as to how the reserve fund will be treated in this transaction.
Okay. What organization are you with again?
It's a firm called Siebert Cisneros Schenck and Company.
Okay. I'm curious about like rating of bonds. Are the bonds for the airport rated aggregately, or each set of bonds has its own rating?
Each set of bonds has its own rating, and we're currently considering going to Moody's and S&P for bond ratings on the contemplated refunding a new money transaction, and that's expected to happen on the 29th of May.
Do you know what the current rating is on these bonds?
Yes, it's A1, A+ from Moody's and A+ from S&P.
A1, A plus?
Yeah, A1 from Moody's and A+ from Standard
Okay.
& Poor's,
Okay. And
which are both investment grade ratings. And again, these are, in the current market, ratings that many investors would find very attractive.
would any additional reserves impact the rating on these specific bonds that the airport may have?
Yes. So there's several ways, I guess, to approach that. There's reserves that the airport has, which, like the ADF, for example. There's also reserves related to the specific bond issuance. And in both cases, the reserves would be considered a benefit to the issuance.
So I understand.
Not sure if I'm answering your question. though.
There's a threshold of reserves for the bonds, right? That's kind of, you called it debt service reserve fund, right? There's a certain a mandatory threshold, correct?
Yes, that's correct.
Okay. And other reserves that the airport may have, is there a certain percentage of the reserves that will help determine whether it gets a higher rating as far as the bond rating?
So that's a good question. I would say that the way that we intend to treat the reserves in the new financing will have an impact on the rating, but more than likely, and this is something that we'll find out on the 29th, but more than likely the ratings it'll be a minor sort of consideration with respect to the ultimate rating on the bonds.
Right. And just for educational purposes, specific type of ratings of the bonds give you more favorable interest rates, is that correct?
Yes, indeed, for sure.
And is it within a certain category of ratings? For example, would an A1 and an A plus give you the same interest rate?
Generally, they should give you the same interest rate because they're considered sort of parity rating levels although they're from two different credit rating agencies. So the higher the rating, generally the lower the interest rate. The lower the rating, particularly as you move out of the investment grade category, the higher the interest rate.
What's the highest interest rate? I mean,
The highest
rating
rating
for
category?
Moody, for example.
It's a great question. That's AAA from either Moody's, S&P, Fitch, and there's another sort of rating agency called Kroll.
Where does A1 fall within Moody's ratings?
It's in the investment grade category, so it's several notches below the AAA rating, but it's still a very high investment grade rating.
Okay. All right, thank you. No further questions.
Okay. Alderman Cohen?
So I don't have any questions for you, but Jim, if you could take the mic. So I'm assuming that the comptroller's office is involved with this since you kind of kicked off the presentation.
That's correct.
So has this been approved by ENA at this point?
It has.
Okay. All right, that's all I had.
Okay. Alderman Muhammad?
He's not here.
Oh, I didn't even see him leave. I'm
I think he
sorry.
went back to the Ways and
Okay.
Means Committee hearing.
Alderwoman Middlebrook?
I have no questions.
Thank you. I don't have any questions.
Thank
It's pretty straightforward. Is there anything else you need to add, Jim? Nothing else? Okay. So,
I make a motion that we pass out Board Bill 13 with a due pass recommendation.
Second.
Previous roll.
thank you.
Thank you.
Okay. I wanted to, so we just had Board Bill number 13, and it has been moved and passed with a recommendation. Thank you. Next item on our agenda is Board Bill number 28. Our presentation, there you are.
Hi, my name's Mario Pandolfo. I'm with the City Councilor's Office.
Okay.
And I'm an attorney manager that's assigned to Lambert Airport. Been there for 20-some years. So this Board Bill 28 is seeking the authorization to, for the director and the comptroller to execute an assignment agreement, consent to assignment agreement between binational, assigning the AL 353 dual customs agreement that we entered into roughly almost 6 years ago, or a little over 6 years ago, to BIAC, which is Brownfield International. The principal owner of both is the same. A little bit of history here. Initially, this agreement, this dual customs agreement, was between the city and BIAC, Brownfield International. And in 2000, I think it was 17, February of 2017, Ricardo, who's the president and owner of Brownfield International, asked us to sign this to Binational, who is the company that he controls, that owns, is not owns, but leases the property at the Northern Track site. So because he has this site, anyway, the reason he asked at that time, back in 2017, was due to the fact that he was looking for funding for the projects that he was going to develop on the site, and using historical tax credits and brownfield tax credits to address a lot of the environmental issues there. He requested, he was told by his advisors at that time that he needed to transfer that agreement to his other company, a Missouri corporation, that would be helpful. So he did so, and we approved that back in 2017. The Board of Aldermen approved that. Now we're in the situation they're in now where they're looking at the financing. They've gotten the historical tax credits, and they're doing the funding and financing for this. They're realizing that this needs to be transferred back to the company that initially had it, back to Brownfield International. So they asked us to consent to that assignment. The key for us, of course, is that Ricardo, who's the president of Brownfield International, is the entity, the individual that we're working with on the dual customs to try to bring dual customs here to St. Louis Lambert International Airport. So what we're asking for your approval of, to authorize us to go ahead and proceed to that assignment. If you have any questions, I'd be happy to answer them.
Okay, so, okay, everybody keeps leaving.
I'm despairing on you.
Yeah, they are. So, Alderman Cohen?
So are Board Bill 28 and 29 related?
Yes, they are.
Okay, can you just elaborate
I
on?
can, and I apologize, I probably should have done that. Actually, if I was doing this, I would have done 29 before 28. It might have made a little bit more sense, but.
Okay.
But in any case, I can talk about 29.
If you could indulge me, that would be
Yes,
wonderful.
no, it makes sense. So the other board bill that we're presenting next is requesting your consent again for Rhonda, in this case, to agree to the change in ownership and control of Binational. Binational, which is presently controlled, at least 70% of that is controlled by Ricardo. In this, as part of this deal, we knew and we anticipated, we knew that one of the major funding sources for the projects, 55 million, actually it's closer to $60 million worth of projects for phase one of the, what we call the AL 94 agreement, has funding for the brownfield and historical tax credits that they have. In order to take advantage of those, they have to restructure their company to comply with the IRS rules and that. So what that consent is about is authorizing the change in ownership. When I negotiated the terms of the AL 94 lease, we anticipated that this funding using historical tax credits would require a change in ownership. So we added language different than in most of our long-term leases, which have language that if you assign agreement to another entity, we have to approve it, which is what we're doing in AL 28. We're just signing that agreement. In this consent, we're not assigning any agreement. Our agreement is still going to be with Binational, but the ownership is changing. And we wanted to know who that ownership would be, and we wanted to have some say in it. So we added language to that agreement that requires the city's approval, which is why we're here before you to consent to the change in ownership and control. So what that consent package sets out is pretty standard process for a historical tax credit. It envisions the creation of two LLCs, a management LLC that is going to consist of 3 different companies that we're aware of, that is CRG, which is, Martin Properties, and a company owned by Mr. Davis. And so they each have, this management company is going to have about 12% control of, 12% ownership, I should say, of Binational. But they will have all the management, day-to-day operations authority. That committee also will have a member, being Ricardo, although he won't have an ownership interest in that management LLC. He'll be part of the management committee as the manager, and we'll have a vote as the same as the other owners. The other part, the other 80-some%, is going to be in the control of, or not control, it's going to be owned by the investors. They will have no say in the ownership or in the control or day-to-day operations, as long as there's not a breach and their security interests are not threatened. They're just the investors. They're the people putting the money into the program. So what this consent for a change in ownership is authorizing this change that we, because of the language we added to the lease, that will give them permission, that will set up this financing structure that will enable them to fund the program, phase one of the development that's called for under the lease, the long-term lease that we have with them, which is around $60 million. So the tie-in here is where we're approving the consent to the change in ownership, where Ricardo's, although he's not going to be the majority owner anymore, he will still have control of the premises, because under the conditions of the agreement, he has a master sublease for all of phase one and options for phase two and three. So the structure of this is that people like CRG, Toby Martin, and the real estate people will build the facility, and Ricardo, through his master lease, will bring the cargo in and have a master sublease, and then sublet to those people that will run their cargo out of Lambert, hopefully. That's the way it's structured, at least. So that's a tie-in. Again, to get the ownership rights, the assignment of the dual customs back to Ricardo and the company that he owned and the company that initially this was with in the beginning. So it's kind of reversing the transaction that we approved earlier.
So the transaction that we approved earlier, is anything aside from the reassignment of
Being changed?
responsibility, is there anything regarding changes in fees, the finance structure related to the lease? None of that is changing. This is just simply the changing of assignments and responsibilities within the
Right.
lease agreement.
Exactly.
And the dual custom agreement as well, right?
Right, and the-
So binational leads me to believe that, like, they're operating in two different countries.
Well, Binational is a company that exists, was created for this lease that they enter into with
So
us.
if we're assigning dual customs, I'm assuming that they're, like, importing, exporting
Well,
goods.
Binational was created in order to enter into a long-term agreement with us. Brownfield International is a company that he initially created that was the dual customs, and that is the company that has the does dual customs across the border currently down in Brownfield, Texas.
Okay.
And does cargo and stuff out of there.
Okay. Okay, I think that's all the questions that I have.
All right. Alderman Boyd?
I apologize, I had to step out for a moment. Out of curiosity, so when the LLC was formed, it was registered with the state of Missouri, correct?
The LLC Binational?
Yeah.
Right. It's a Missouri corporation.
And it has an operating agreement?
And it has a long-term lease, AL 94, which is a lease, long-term lease that was approved a few months back.
I'm talking about.
Correct.
So
Right.
when you form an LLC, you also must have an operating agreement, which basically tells you some of the same things that Exhibit A says,
Right.
but it's actually called an operating agreement by law, right?
Yes, I believe that's true, yes.
So Exhibit A is kind of a pseudo operating agreement?
Well, no, you're looking at now, are we looking at the, I just want to make sure I know what I'm looking at. Are we talking
I'm on
about?
29, Board Bill 29.
We're on
on
Board Bill
28.
29, not 28.
I thought she was talking about.
Yeah, that's
both
fine.
at
We
the
were,
same time.
actually,
So
we
I
were
jumped
talking
ahead
about
then.
both.
We were actually talking about both of them at the same time.
And what 29 is showing is you have Binational right now, which is an LLC, in which that ownership presently is 70% owned by Ricardo, one of Ricardo's other companies. And it has other ownership, Toby Martin, which has like 5% presently or whatever. So we have as set out in the briefing paper, what is being shown is the structure of that entity, what it will be after we approve this consent. What it envisions is the creation of two, it's not changing, they're creating two entities, a management LLC.
Which is, which is binational.
Well, if you look at Exhibit A, for example, the management of Binational presently And then what it says is when it goes, the team for the ownership and management of CR's cargo. Now, let me back up and make it a little bit more clear, I think. If you look at the ownership of the management LLC at the very bottom of page 3.
Are we on board with 29 or 28?
29.
You're on 20, okay, I want to make sure we.
Okay, 29, if you go to Exhibit A, page 3 at the bottom there, that's the ownership of the management LLC. That consists of CRG Air Cargo and LLC owned by and managed by, and there's a listing of the people there, but that's your Mr. Clark and Larry Chapman. Larry's the managing partner, I think, with 20%. The other entity involved is Martin Properties LLC, which is owned and controlled by Toby Martin. And then you have Rock Hard Assets, which is owned and operated by Jonathan Davis. They all will have a 33 1/3% interest. That there's also created is a management committee, which each one of them has a representative to. But in addition to that, the manager of the managing committee is, in fact, Ricardo Ferris, or his designee. That management LLC has the day-to-day operations authority in regard to binational. So they will be the ones that are getting the financing together and the loans together, and they will be doing the real estate side of this. On the other piece of this, you then have an LLC being created for investors. And they will have no operating, and they're not a part of the management committee. They're simply providing the funds and the investment in this. That LLC will have rights that you would expect an LLC investing for companies to have, which would be if you don't make the payments or you don't do certain things, then they can protect their security interests. So the same as what a bank would have if they made a mortgage payment, as you well know.
I understand the mechanics of how everything's supposed to operate. I just, having formed a LLC and having purchased property with the LLC, I know there's an operating agreement that goes along with every LLC, which spells out exactly what you're kind of saying, who manages it, how you dispose of property, so on and so on and so forth. And I have to present that at closing so that the bank understands clearly, kind of like what you're saying with attachment A. Who does what and what percentage is owned by whomever. And so that's why I was asking, was there an actual operating agreement?
For those
For all the LLCs.
that are being created. What this consent will be is to authorize the director to authorize them to do that. As the agreement is set out, there's a requirement that they provide that information to us, and then there is a condition also subsequent later on that says that they have a certain period of time to close, and prior to that closing, all this data information, additional information about their financial structure and the rest has to be presented for our review and approval before that happens. If that closing doesn't occur, then we terminate the agreement. And that's how it's structured. Does that help you, or does that answer your question?
Well, it kind of, but it almost sounds like that you say, I'm going to do this. This is my plan to do that, but I haven't done it, which it should already be done.
No,
Alderman.
they've been created.
I mean, the operating agreement.
Yes.
Well, I think Alderman Boyd, though, if you go back to the original 40-year lease, that is what this is attached to. That 40-year lease talks about the phases of the build-out, and it talks about the uses for that building. So that is all in the original 40-year lease that we had.
Right.
This is.
That's not changing.
That hasn't changed. I think Alderman Cohn asked that same question when you stepped out. That lease has not changed. That was approved here prior, and that lease has not changed.
And the terms of that aren't being changed.
And I think that would probably help answer your questions. Happy to get you a copy of that if you have not seen it.
No, I was just trying to follow the process because he kept speaking to the different LLCs and what people were doing. And I just know it's always spelled out in the operating agreement. So that's why I raised those questions.
Right. And-
But I'm fine with the lease, and you're
Yeah.
just basically taking it from this ownership to that owner. That's not a problem. I was just trying to follow the process.
Right. And I guess the answer I have is that this consent is giving them the ability to do that.
Okay.
And then down the road, we're going to have to approve that transaction.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
Very good. So Alderman Cone, you've spoken. Is Mohammed back? No. Alderwoman Middlebrook?
I have no questions.
Okay. Was there anything else for you to close that you need to share with us?
No, ma'am.
Okay. I'll accept a motion.
I make a motion, or I move that we pass Board Bill 28 out with a due pass recommendation.
Second.
Previous roll.
It's been moved and second, the acceptance of the previous roll. Board Bill number 28 has been approved for due pass recommendation.
Thank you.
Shall we move forward with Board Bill 29? I'll accept a motion.
I move that we pass Board Bill 29 out with a due pass recommendation.
Second.
Previous roll.
It's been moved second. We accept the previous roll. Board Bill number 29 has been moved for a due pass recommendation, and we are very happy to hear that. And I say that because I've sat through this twice at the airport commissioners meeting. So I feel like I could go and run this thing for them. But I thank you very much for that presentation. That is the end of our
Thank you.
board bills for today. We have no resolutions. I would like to have a quick committee discussion, if you don't mind. I wish we had more of our members here, which is the first thing that I'm going to talk about. I will be enforcing our rules that say if you miss 3 meetings without being excused, with a proper excuse, I will be asking for your removal from the committee. Also, as we move forward, we have our vice chair is Alderman Cohen. So we'll be looking at that. I always ask for a consensus on the day that we should meet. And we have been meeting on Thursdays at 10:30. And I wanted to ask if that's still convenient, or should we use another day? What's more convenient for you?
I serve at the pleasure of the chair.
I like that. Anybody else?
For me personally, a 9 or 9:30 meeting is usually easier to work into the schedule. A lot
Okay.
of folks start scheduling things at 10 or 11,
Okay.
so doing a 10:30, especially depending upon how long the meeting is going to last. But Thursdays in the morning generally work for me.
Thursday mornings. Okay, how about you, Alderman?
Thursdays work. Yeah, the first Thursday of every month, maybe.
We won't ever be having a meeting on the first Thursday because we have our commissioner meetings the first Wednesday of the month, and bills come from that meeting to our committee, and so it will be the next Thursday, okay? All right, so we'll make sure that we know that we definitely will have a meeting on the second Thursday of the month, and you prefer to have it earlier, at 9? And so we'll have it at 9, and there'll probably be a rare occasion that we would have to have another meeting in the month, but I doubt it. So we'll just have to play it by ear. The other things that I wanted to talk about very quickly is, because we have new members, not only on this committee, but also with the Board of Aldermen, I wanted to go through the same process I went through before at the beginning, which is have our airport director come in and explain about how the airport is operated along with some of our staff. Also, I'd like to make an opportunity for a tour for the airport so that you can see a lot of the things that people have been talking about for various different reasons. And because of the Fly 314 process, which is looking at how to monetize the airport and/or if the airport can be monetized. I think it's important for us to have that presentation as well, to see what has been done thus far, how the schedule is planned for the resolution of this. And so those three things, most especially, airport director's presentation, a tour, and Fly 314 are critical to this committee being prepared to do its work. So I'd like to get those things scheduled as soon as possible and get it out the way so it won't interfere with our normal schedule of meetings. And hopefully, we could do all three of these on the same day if you all can come up with a day or time that works for the majority of us and other aldermen that might be interested, because we could do all that at the airport. We could do the tour, the director's presentation, and the other one at the airport, have all that out the way, instead of having 2 or 3 sessions.
Something like that would probably, at least for me, be generally better after a Friday meeting to get,
After a Friday meeting, okay?
if we're planning on spending, like doing a tour and
Yeah.
presentations. and all
Yeah,
that.
because all of it, the tour took about 45 minutes, I think.
Oh, I thought it
last
was
time.
longer than that.
Was it longer than that?
I thought it was about an hour, hour and a half.
Was it an hour? Okay, you know me in time. Okay, so,
I probably won't be able to do that after unless it's be done by 1:30, unless we could be done by 1:30, because I have to be somewhere at 2 o'clock on Fridays.
So if it's earlier in session, we won't have any board bills up for debate on the floor, so our meeting
like we
is,
had a short meeting last Friday.
right, so
We should have a short meeting this Friday.
if we do it early enough in session where we're over by 11 or 11:30, then that'll give us about 2 hours, basically.
That would help.
That would help. Let's see what we can do as soon as possible. How about that? And then that way, it's before we'll be debating anything. Okay. I'll look at that and I'll check with the airport director's schedule and see if we can't get that done. And then I wanted to ask, are there any other things that you would like to see come before the committee that would help you with our understanding of what our task is? I hear nothing. Okay, so I'm sorry, but I find no other way but to implement the rules because it's so hard to get a quorum, and this is important work, and we're supposed to be present. So, does anybody have any objection to that? Okay. I appreciate that, and so I shall call this meeting adjourned.